Carl Jung discovered that empaths aren't born to heal others. They're born to awaken humanity's collective shadow. The pain they absorb isn't meant to be healed away. The darkness they feel isn't meant to be fixed. And most shocking of all, their suffering serves a purpose they never understood: to force an unconscious world to face what it's been desperately avoiding. Picture this moment. You've spent your entire life absorbing other people's emotions. Their anger becomes your anxiety. Their shame becomes your self-doubt. Their unprocessed trauma seeps into your nervous system until you can't tell where they end and you begin. You think you're broken, too sensitive, cursed with a burden no one else understands. But something shifts when you discover the truth. Instead of trying to heal what you've absorbed, you realize you were never meant to carry it permanently. You were meant to feel it, witness it, and reflect it back to a world that refuses to look in the mirror. Jung called empaths the wounded mirrors of humanity, and he understood that mirrors don't heal what they reflect. They reveal it. And for the collective unconscious, this revelation changes everything. But here's what makes this discovery so dangerous for society. The empath's true function threatens the unconscious contracts that entire cultures depend on, the collective agreement to keep certain truths buried, certain emotions unexpressed, certain shadows hidden. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. But empaths make this avoidance impossible. They become what I call shadow detectors, walking truth machines that expose what others work desperately to conceal. This is why empaths are so often misunderstood, pathologized, or labeled too much. Their very existence disrupts the comfortable illusions that keep unconscious people functioning. They don't just feel emotions. They feel the emotions that an entire family, community, or culture has collectively repressed. Jung understood that empaths serve an archetypal function. They're not just individuals with heightened sensitivity. They're carriers of what he called the unlived life of humanity. Every unexpressed grief, every swallowed rage, every denied truth gets channeled through their nervous system. But society tells them they're here to heal this pain away, to fix it, to make it better. This is the cruelest lie of all, because the moment an empath realizes they're not broken vessels needing repair, but sacred mirrors reflecting collective truth, everything changes. Jung spent decades studying what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological material that all humanity carries. But within this collective unconscious lies something darker, more disturbing, what I call the collective shadow, the accumulated darkness of generations. This isn't just personal shadow work. This is ancestral trauma, cultural shame, societal guilt, and collective rage that has been passed down through bloodlines and communities. Jung wrote, "The foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. But someone has to experience it. Someone has to carry what others refuse to feel. That someone is the empath." Jung observed, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. The secret order is this: empaths are unconsciously selected by archetypal forces to serve as containers for collective psychological waste. They don't choose this role, they're born into it." But here's where Jung's insight becomes revolutionary. He discovered that empaths aren't meant to heal this collective shadow. They're meant to make it conscious. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The empath's job is to feel the unfelt, name the unnamed, and reflect back to society the parts of itself it refuses to acknowledge. When an empath breaks down from absorbing too much, they're not having a personal crisis. They're having a collective crisis on behalf of everyone around them. This is why empaths often feel like they're carrying the weight of the world. They literally are. Jung called this participation mystique, an unconscious merger with collective psychological content that creates the illusion of personal responsibility for universal pain. If you've ever felt like you're carrying pain that doesn't belong to you, comment, "I carry what others won't face." The empath becomes what Jung would recognize as a scapegoat, not in the sense of being blamed, but in the archetypal sense of carrying the sins of the community. But unlike traditional scapegoats who are cast out, the modern empath is kept close, needed for their function while being told they're too sensitive. Jung understood that empaths function as psychological mirrors, but not the kind that simply reflect back what people want to see. They're what I call shadow mirrors. They reflect back the parts of people that they've disowned, denied, or buried in their unconscious. This mirror function operates automatically. The empath doesn't choose to absorb others' shadows. It happens through what Jung called unconscious projection. People unconsciously cast their unprocessed emotional material onto the empath, who then carries it in their own system. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But most people don't want this understanding. They prefer to keep their irritations projected onto others, rather than examine what these reactions reveal about their own psyche. The empath becomes the repository for these projections. They feel the anger that others suppress. They carry the sadness that others won't cry. They tremble with anxiety from trauma they never experienced personally. This isn't empathy in the traditional sense. It's what I call archetypal absorption. But here's where Jung's understanding becomes crucial. He observed that these projections serve a purpose. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." The empath shadow mirror creates a chemical reaction that forces transformation. When someone encounters an empath who reflects their disowned shadow material, they have two choices: integrate what they see or reject the mirror entirely. Most people choose rejection. They call the empath crazy, too sensitive, or dramatic. Jung would recognize this as projection withdrawal, the unconscious mind's defense against having its hidden material exposed. But some people are ready for integration. They see themselves clearly in the empath's reflection and begin their own shadow work. This is why empaths often attract people at crucial transformation points in their lives. The empath serves as what Jung called a transcendent function, a bridge between conscious and unconscious, between what people think they are and what they actually are. This function is sacred, but it comes at an enormous cost to the empath, who often loses themselves in the process. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But empaths often can't become themselves because they're too busy being repositories for everyone else's unlived life. There comes a moment in every empath's journey when the shadow absorption reaches a critical point. Jung called this the dark night of the soul, but for empaths, it's more specific. It's what I call shadow saturation, the moment when they've absorbed more collective darkness than their individual psyche can process. This isn't depression, though it may look like it. This isn't anxiety, though the symptoms appear similar. This is the psyche's emergency response to carrying psychological material that belongs to generations of people. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." But the empath's pain isn't just personal, it's archetypal. They're experiencing the labor pains of collective consciousness trying to be born. Every breakdown is actually a breakthrough waiting to happen, but only if the empath understands what's really occurring. Jung observed that when individuals carry too much unconscious material, the psyche begins to separate, not as mental illness, but as a protective mechanism. The empath's authentic self goes into hiding, while a shadow-carrying self emerges to handle the collective burden. This creates what I call the empath's dilemma. They lose touch with their own authentic emotions because they're flooded with absorbed ones. They can't tell what's theirs and what belongs to others. Jung wrote, "The greatest danger is that one may get stuck in the unconscious and never come back to reality." But here's where Jung's insight becomes liberating. He understood that this crisis point isn't a breakdown, it's an initiation. The empath is being forced to differentiate between personal and collective psychological material. They must learn what Jung called active imagination, consciously engaging with shadow content instead of passively absorbing it. Comment if you've reached a point where you couldn't tell your emotions from others. I lost myself in everyone else. The shadow saturation phase serves a crucial function. It forces the empath to develop what I call shadow literacy, the ability to read, interpret, and process collective psychological material without being consumed by it. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For empaths, this acceptance includes acknowledging their role as shadow carriers, while refusing to remain trapped in that function forever. This is where the real work begins. Not healing the shadow, that's impossible. Not eliminating it, that would be dangerous. But learning to work with it consciously, to transform from passive absorber to active translator of collective unconscious material. Jung discovered that the only way to work with shadow material is through what he called conscious suffering. This doesn't mean prolonging pain unnecessarily. It means facing the darkness with awareness instead of being unconsciously consumed by it. For empaths, this awakening process begins with a radical realization. The pain they're carrying isn't meant to be healed. It's meant to be witnessed, processed, and transformed. Jung wrote, "We don't really heal anything, we simply let it go." But letting go requires first understanding what you're holding. The empath must learn to distinguish between different types of shadow material. Some belongs to their personal history, some belongs to their family line, some belongs to their culture, and some belongs to humanity itself. This differentiation process is what I call shadow archaeology, digging through layers of absorbed material to find the authentic self buried underneath. Jung called this process individuation, becoming who you truly are beneath all the projections and absorptions. The awakened empath develops what Jung would recognize as conscious empathy, the ability to feel with others without losing themselves in the process. They become what I call shadow translators, individuals who can interpret collective unconscious material and make it accessible to consciousness. Jung wrote, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity." The empath's inner necessity is to transform collective shadow into collective consciousness. This transformation doesn't happen through traditional healing methods. It requires what Jung called active imagination, consciously engaging with shadow material through dreams, art, writing, or other creative expressions. The empath learns to give form to the formless, language to the unspeakable. But here's where Jung's understanding becomes revolutionary. He realized that individuals who successfully integrate their shadow don't just heal themselves, they heal the collective. Every person who makes unconscious material conscious contributes to the evolution of human awareness. The awakened empath becomes what Jung called a wounded healer, someone whose personal integration of shadow material creates healing possibilities for others. They don't heal by fixing people's problems. They heal by modeling what conscious shadow integration looks like. Jung observed, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." The empath's journey is unique, but their destination serves a universal function, awakening the collective shadow so it can be integrated rather than projected. This is why empaths often feel called to creative work, healing professions, or social activism. They're unconsciously driven to transform the shadow material they've absorbed into something useful, for collective consciousness. Jung identified archetypal patterns that repeat throughout human history. The awakened empath embodies what I call the shadow awakener archetype, individuals who serve as catalysts for collective consciousness evolution. This archetype appears in myths and stories across cultures. The oracle who speaks uncomfortable truths, the prophet who reveals what people don't want to see, the artist who expresses collective pain, the healer who makes visible what has been hidden. Jung wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. The shadow awakener faces the opposite challenge. They must avoid being overwhelmed by the tribe's unconscious material, while still serving their function as collective mirror. The awakened empath develops what I call sacred boundaries, not walls that keep everything out, but permeable membranes that allow conscious engagement with shadow material while preventing unconscious absorption. These boundaries operate on multiple levels: physical boundaries that protect the empath's energy, emotional boundaries that distinguish between personal and absorbed feelings, mental boundaries that separate the empath's thoughts from collective mental projections, and spiritual boundaries that maintain connection to their authentic self while serving their archetypal function. Jung understood that individuals who embody archetypal energies often pay a significant personal cost. The shadow awakener frequently experiences isolation, misunderstanding, and persecution because their function threatens established unconscious patterns. But Jung also recognized that these individuals are essential for human evolution. He wrote, "Man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. Someone must serve as the bridge between unconscious and conscious, between shadow and light. The shadow awakener doesn't eliminate collective shadow. That would be impossible and dangerous. Instead, they transform it through the alchemy of consciousness. They take raw, unconscious shadow material and refine it into wisdom, art, healing, and truth. This transformation process requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites in creative tension until something new emerges. The shadow awakener must be both sensitive enough to absorb shadow material and strong enough not to be destroyed by it. If you've ever felt like your sensitivity is actually your strength, comment, 'My wounds became my wisdom.'" Jung observed that individuals who successfully embody the shadow awakener archetype often become what he called cultural creatives, people who generate new forms of consciousness for their communities. They may become artists, writers, therapists, spiritual teachers, or social activists. But their true power lies not in what they do, but in who they become. The integrated shadow awakener radiates a quality of presence that unconsciously invites others to face their own shadow material. They become living examples that conscious shadow integration is possible. This presence is both magnetic and threatening. Some people are drawn to the shadow awakener's authenticity and depth. Others are repelled by the unconscious demand for honesty that the shadow awakener's presence creates. Jung warned about what he called the inflation trap, the danger of identifying too completely with archetypal energies. Shadow awakeners face a unique version of this challenge. They must avoid becoming addicted to their role as shadow carriers, while still fulfilling their function. This integration requires what Jung called the union of opposites, holding both the individual self and the archetypal function in conscious balance. The shadow awakener must be both personal and transpersonal, both wounded and healed, both sensitive and strong. Jung wrote, "The first half of life is devoted to forming a healthy ego. The second half is going inward and letting go of it." For shadow awakeners, this process is complicated by their archetypal function. They must develop a strong enough ego to handle collective shadow material, then learn to let go of identifying with that role. The integration process involves what I call conscious role management, understanding when to engage with collective shadow material and when to retreat into personal authenticity. This isn't avoidance, it's sustainable shadow work. Jung observed, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong. The shadow awakener learns to ride this pendulum consciously, moving between individual needs and collective service without being thrown off balance. But integration also requires facing a painful truth. Not everyone wants their shadow awakened." Jung wrote, "Thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. Many people prefer their unconscious patterns to the discomfort of awareness. The shadow awakener must learn to offer their gift without forcing it, to reflect truth without demanding acceptance, to serve their function without sacrificing their well-being. This requires what Jung called appropriate detachment, caring without attachment to outcomes. Jung understood that successful integration creates what he called the wise fool, someone who combines deep wisdom with childlike openness. The integrated shadow awakener embodies this paradox. They carry profound knowledge of human darkness while maintaining hope for human light. This balance allows them to work with shadow material without being consumed by despair. They understand that shadow isn't evil, it's unlived potential waiting to be transformed. Jung wrote, "In order to know the light, we must first experience the darkness." The shadow awakener has experienced more darkness than most, which gives them unique authority to speak about light. They don't preach spiritual bypassing or positive thinking. They offer genuine hope, born from conscious engagement with collective pain. Comment if you've learned to work with darkness without being consumed by it. I transform shadow into light. Jung believed that individual transformation inevitably creates collective transformation. He wrote, "As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. The shadow awakener kindles this light by making collective darkness conscious. This process doesn't happen through preaching or teaching. It happens through embodiment. The shadow awakener's presence creates what I call consciousness contagion. Their integrated authenticity unconsciously invites others to examine their own shadow material." Jung observed that when enough individuals in a culture begin integrating their shadow, it creates a morphic field that makes shadow work easier for everyone. The collective unconscious begins to shift from repression toward conscious integration. We're witnessing this shift now. More people are recognizing that traditional approaches to mental health, relationships, and social problems aren't working because they ignore shadow dynamics. The collective is beginning to understand what Jung knew. You can't heal what you won't face. Shadow awakeners serve as midwives to this collective birth process. They help bring unconscious material into consciousness, not through force, but through patient reflection. They hold space for others to see themselves clearly without judgment. But this process is neither comfortable nor quick. Jung wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. Shadow integration isn't about solving darkness. It's about outgrowing the need to deny it." The shadow awakener models this outgrowing process. They demonstrate that it's possible to acknowledge collective darkness without being paralyzed by it, to feel collective pain without being destroyed by it, to carry collective shadow without losing individual identity. This modeling effect creates permission for others to begin their own shadow work. People see that it's possible to face difficult truths and survive, to feel deeply and remain functional, to be sensitive and still be strong. Jung understood that cultural evolution happens through what he called the conscious individual. These individuals don't change the world through external action alone. They change it by transforming the collective unconscious through their own integration. The shadow awakener contributes to this transformation by refusing to participate in collective denial. They won't pretend that everything is fine when it isn't. They won't smile when they feel like crying. They won't agree when they disagree. They become living examples of authentic response to reality. This authenticity is both revolutionary and evolutionary. Revolutionary because it challenges unconscious cultural patterns. Evolutionary because it points toward a more conscious way of being human. Jung understood that archetypal embodiment always comes with a cost. For shadow awakeners, this cost is often profound loneliness. They see what others cannot or will not see, which creates inevitable isolation from those still living unconsciously. Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." Shadow awakeners often struggle to find others who can understand their experiences or appreciate their function. This loneliness is compounded by the fact that shadow awakeners often attract people who are not seeking genuine connection but unconscious shadow projection. They become magnets for those who need someone to carry their pain rather than process it themselves. Learning to distinguish between authentic relationship and unconscious projection becomes essential for the shadow awakener's survival. Jung wrote, "Where love reigns, there is no will to power, and where the will to power is paramount, love is lacking." Genuine relationships for shadow awakeners are characterized by mutual consciousness rather than unconscious neediness. These relationships are rare but profound, connections between individuals who have done their own shadow work and can appreciate each other's authenticity. But the isolation often serves a purpose. Jung observed that individuals embodying archetypal functions frequently need periods of solitude to process the collective material they carry. The hermit phase isn't punishment, it's integration time. During these periods, shadow awakeners often discover their creative gifts. Jung wrote, "The debt we owe to the play of imagination is incalculable. The shadow material they've absorbed becomes raw material for artistic expression, healing modalities, or spiritual insights. This is the gift that balances the cost." Shadow awakeners often develop extraordinary creative abilities, deep spiritual insights, or powerful healing presence. They become what Jung called wounded healers, individuals whose personal integration creates healing possibilities for others. The gift isn't separate from the wound, it emerges from it. The capacity to absorb collective shadow becomes the capacity to transform it. The sensitivity that once felt like a curse becomes a sacred calling. Jung wrote, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." Shadow awakeners embody this principle. They don't just talk about consciousness, they live it. They don't just teach shadow work, they demonstrate its fruits. Jung envisioned what he called the transformation of consciousness, a collective shift from unconscious projection to conscious integration. Shadow awakeners are the advanced scouts of this transformation, exploring territories of consciousness that others haven't yet dared to enter. This isn't a comfortable revolution. Jung wrote, "We cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." The consciousness revolution requires accepting rather than condemning shadow material, which challenges every religious and cultural tradition based on good versus evil thinking. Shadow awakeners model this acceptance. They demonstrate that it's possible to acknowledge darkness without being consumed by it, to feel collective pain without becoming victims of it, to carry shadow material without identifying with it. This modeling creates what I call consciousness permission. Others see that radical acceptance is survivable and begin to attempt it themselves. The revolution spreads not through ideology, but through embodied example. But this revolution faces enormous resistance. Jung observed that collective unconsciousness serves important social functions. It maintains group cohesion through shared denial, creates scapegoats to carry collective shadow, and preserves power structures based on projection dynamics. Shadow awakeners threaten these structures simply by existing consciously. They refuse to carry projections, decline to serve as scapegoats, and model individual authenticity over group conformity. This refusal disrupts unconscious social contracts. The resistance can be fierce. Jung wrote, "Show me a sane man, and I will cure him for you." Society often pathologizes those who see through collective illusions, labeling them as mentally ill, rather than examining what they're revealing. But the consciousness revolution is accelerating. More people are recognizing that collective unconsciousness creates more problems than it solves. The shadow material that cultures have repressed is erupting in symptoms that can no longer be ignored. Jung predicted this eruption. He understood that what remains unconscious doesn't disappear. It grows in power until it can no longer be contained. The choice becomes conscious integration or unconscious explosion. Shadow awakeners offer a third option, conscious transformation. They demonstrate that shadow material can be integrated creatively rather than explosively. They model the possibility of individual wholeness within collective consciousness. If you're ready to stop carrying others' shadows and start awakening them instead, comment, "I choose conscious transformation." The empath who discovers they're not born to heal, but to awaken faces a choice that Jung understood changes everything. They can continue carrying collective shadow unconsciously, slowly depleting themselves in service to others' denial. Or they can transform into what Jung envisioned, conscious individuals who serve collective evolution through their own integration. Jung wrote, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." The shadow awakener chooses to look inside, not just at their personal material, but at the collective content they've been carrying. This awakening reveals both the burden and the gift of their archetypal function. You weren't born broken. You weren't born to fix others' brokenness. You were born to be a mirror that reflects what needs to be seen, a translator who gives language to the unspeakable, a bridge between unconscious and conscious. Your sensitivity isn't a curse, it's a calling. Your ability to feel deeply isn't a weakness, it's a superpower. Your tendency to absorb others' emotions isn't pathology, it's prophecy. You are the early warning system for collective consciousness. But prophecy without integration becomes suffering. The empath who remains unconscious of their archetypal function will be consumed by it. Only through understanding their true purpose can they transform from passive absorber to active awakener. Jung believed that individuals who successfully integrate archetypal energies become agents of evolution. They don't just heal themselves, they contribute to the healing of consciousness itself. They become what he called culture creators, people who generate new possibilities for human awareness. This is your invitation. Stop trying to heal what cannot be healed and start awakening what needs to be conscious. Stop carrying shadows that belong to others and start reflecting them back transformed. If you want to explore more about recognizing your true archetypal function versus the roles others have projected onto you, check out my video on 8 signs you're not meant for this world, where I dive deeper into Jung's insights about those who operate from different consciousness levels. Your darkness was never meant to be eliminated. It was meant to be illuminated. And in that illumination, both you and the world transform. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.